Alright, today we're going to be talking about grading services and what they do, how they grade, and why grading services are beneficial towards collectors and towards getting your trading cards graded, why you should do it. Um, Grading services are third-party, unbiased, or supposedly unbiased opinions on conditions of cards, and then also authenticating cards as actual authentic and not fakes or counterfeits, and also not being tampered with, such as like trimmed corners on sports cards or restoration done to the card. I say that they're supposedly unbiased because these grading companies, they can benefit from having high grades on cards. The more high grades of cards that are out in the market, the more collectors are going to be buying those cards because they want, the absolute highest grades on cards. They want the best condition cards, and then also grading cards with high grades. Collectors are more likely to be grading with that company if they're going to be getting back these high grades. That can also hurt the grading company as well, because grading companies, they're not held to any license. They're not held to any like higher power or standards. So when they give out these grades to cards, it's their own word that's really backing the grade. And so for something like this PSA 10 Change of Heart here, when this card gets graded and goes out to its collectors and gets out into the market, this is basically PSA putting this card out to compete with other grading companies. So this card's a gem mint, but then also this Blue Eyes White Dragon from Beckett is also a gem mint card. So when these cards go out, they're competing against each other, and you can just look at them side by side. And if some of these cards, if the Beckett card isn't and as good a condition as the PSA card, then collectors are going to be wondering, why am I spending the same amount of money for a card that's not as good a condition, even though it's graded the same. So that can hurt grading companies. Grading, it benefits you for encasing your cards, making them display really nicely, giving them the description, authenticating the card, uh, encapsulating them in this protective case, and then uh, it also really helps in determining condition. So by using that third party determining condition, and then also like with just selling and this selling your collection as well, or just selling cards in general that are graded. So if I was going to sell this Change of Heart card, I would just put it on eBay and then have it right here in the description of what it is. It's a Yu-Gi-Oh! Metal Raiders Change of Heart First Edition, graded PSA 10 Gem Mint. And that's the condition. And I don't really need to do anything else. I don't need to like take pictures of every corner and then say how I think the card is, because PSA has already used their opinion on what the condition is, and then that's what I'm going to be using for selling it. If this card wasn't encapsulated and wasn't graded, then what I would have to do is I'd have to take pictures of every corner of this card, and then pictures of the surface at multiple angles to try to show that there's no scratches on the hollow foil, and and then just describe the card in generally, and say that I think it's a near mint to mint condition card. But even then, that's still just my own word on the card, and not the backing of a company like PSA. So, selling these cards as graded, it just makes it so much easier. It increases the value tremendously as well, because when buyers are buying graded cards, they know what they're getting, whereas buying loose cards, it's always a gamble. And so now that we've kind of went over what grading services do, I'm going to start by going into each grading service, or some of the grading services, I should say, and talking about what they individually do. So we're going to start first with PSA. That's typically the most popular and generally considered the best grading service. The reason why they're considered the best is that they have the most strict standards on their grading. So when you're talking about like a PSA 10 card, it is typically a virtually perfect card, or a PSA 9 mint card. It is a very mint card. Uh, they're typically just the best and highest standard with their grades. And so what PSA does for their grading is they grade on a number scale from 1 to 10, 1 being the worst, 10 being the best. 10 gem mint, 9 mint, 8 near mint to mint, 7 near mint, and then so on. I'm not going to go through all of them, but on top of just the number grading, PSA also offers what they're called qualifier grades. And I've done an entire video on this, but I'll go over it a little bit again. PSA has 6 qualifier grades. Those grades are OC for off-center, MC for miscut, ST for stain, MK for mark, PD for print defect, and OF for out of focus. And so right here I have a example of a qualifier grade where this mu card is, if you can see that it's very off center. This left border is much thinner than this right border, and what PSA does is that PSA recognizes this as a printing error, and so instead of docking the card for this off-center grade, they recognize this card as a unique printing error, and that it is a collectible card because of that printing error and the uniqueness to the card. And so if I was to grade this with like Beckett would just say, well, this is a poorly centered card, we're going to dock it on the grading. And instead, PSA is using their qualifier grade of OC to basically take the centering out of this card, out of the grading scale, and then just using the rest of the grading, or the rest of the like the centering and or the corners and the surface and the edges as part of the grading. And so the rest of it is perfectly fine. That's why it gets this mint 9, but it can't get that 10 because it's not a perfect card. And so that's why it gets that OC for the off center. So it's a 9 OC. And these qualifying grades are optional as well. I know that some sports cards collectors, they don't care for these PSA qualifier grades at all. And so even if they have a card like this that would, qualify for the OC off-center qualifier, instead of marking the card to be graded with a qualifier, they'll just mark it to be graded as regularly. And so, if this card was graded without the qualifier, it'd probably get like a 7 because of the centering. And then what PSA also does, besides the qualifiers, is just authentication grades. So authentication grades are not any condition grade, they're just authenticating the card. And what collectors usually do for those is that they'll send a card in if it's in poor condition, but want it to be authenticated as a legitimate, not counterfeit, not tampered with card. So it still does increase the value, and it's recognizing and it's assuring to buyers that they are buying a legitimate card, even though it's not got the grade to it. And so I've got an example of that right here with this Pokemon miscut card. And so right here in this description, it's got the Leafeon, that's the card itself, and then the miscut, and there's no grade here. This number 10 right here is the number of the card, not the grade. And then what this miscut is it's actually got a square corner. I can zoom in on here. So Pokemon is supposed to have round corners, but this card has a square corner that it was cut with. You can see. And so typically when authentication grades get done, they'll encapsulate the card as well. You have to opt in for that. So like you still have to pay for the encapsulation and the grade, even though you're not getting the card graded. This one didn't get the encapsulation, but it can. And then the reason why this card was just authenticated and not graded is because this card can't get graded. And the reason is that PSA, obviously they look at corners whenever they grade cards. This card, because it has that square corner here, means that it can't get graded on its corners because its corner is wrong. And so because it can't get graded on the corners, PSA can't give it a number grade. And so because of that, it can't get graded, and it only gets the authentication as a miscut. And when you're dealing with Pokemon cards, these square cut cards can come up a lot. It's always good to get these square cut cards authenticated by PSA or by another grading company. Mostly, I would say just do it with PSA, because I'm not entirely sure which other grading companies just do authentications. But the reason being is that the older Pokemon cards from base set, there were a lot of sheets of those cards that were available, and so what people did was they bought the sheets and then square cut the cards themselves, and then sold the cards as error cards of being square cut. And so getting, these square cut Pokemon cards authenticated is always nice, because that way you know that you're actually getting a legitimately factory cut square cut card, and not something that someone else cut themselves. And then moving on, I wanted to finish off by talking about mistakes by PSA. There's been videos complaining about PSA. Any grading company is going to have complaints about their service. When you're grading hundreds of thousands and sometimes even millions of cards, it's going to happen. There's going to be customer service complaints. But there are videos of issues with PSA. One of the most recent being PSA grading fake Yu-Gi-Oh cards, and then another one that happened a few years ago by the Charizard Authority. He graded a complete first edition Exodia set from Legend of Blue Eyes, and a couple of his cards were actually damaged by PSA, and he wasn't alerted or reimbursed when he made the video anyway from PSA. So they never told him that the cards were damaged, and unless he got the reimbursement afterwards, they never reimbursed him for the value of the cards. You'd have to talk to him about that. I'm sure he contacted him, but there are issues, there are issues with PSA in that sense, and it's somewhat understandable. I'm not trying to defend the grading card service, but it's understandable to the extent that when you're dealing with like non-sports trading cards, is what Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, Magic the Gathering, those are non-sports trading cards. They're nowhere near as profitable to grading companies as sports cards. They're just such a smaller market compared to your sports cards for hockey, football, baseball, any basically sports cards. They're just such a bigger profit to grading companies. And so the reason why the complications are happening with these the non-sports cards being kind of overlooked, and fake cards being graded and not being looked at as closely, is largely in part because they're just not as big of a market. And especially with even Yu-Gi-Oh, where Yu-Gi-Oh cards are just now starting to get graded and like a higher quantity than what they were before. There are a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh cards that are in single-digit pops for PSA 10, or just a pop of 1, or even a pop of 0. And it's not because that they're super rare. It's just because these cards are now starting to finally get sent to PSA to be graded. So moving on now, I want to talk about Beckett. And just like with PSA, we're first going to go look at how they grade. And so Beckett is unique because they do this 4 subgrades for their grading service. And these subgrades are centering, corners, edges, and surface, which are typically the 4 things that you almost always look at when you're determining the condition of trading cards. And then what Beckett does is they use these 4 subgrades to give the card an overall single-digit grade. And so Beckett has their card grading numbers from 1 to 10 for single digits. 10 is pristine, 9.5 is their gem mint, and then 9 is their mint. And how Beckett uses those subgrades to grade for the final grade. I'll use this card as an example. This card has 3 9.5s and 1 10. The 3 9.5s and the 1 10, and that's what gave it the 9.5. What's really nice about these Beckett cards with these subgrades is that you can see what's wrong with the card, or if I sent this off and I thought for sure that this is supposed to be like a Beckett 10, and I can see, well, I guess everything was just a little bit not quite up to 10. Maybe I can send this card again and then it'll get a Beckett 10. Whereas with PSA, if you send off a card to PSA and it gets a 9, PSA doesn't say, why it got a 9. So if you're just sitting there scratching your head thinking, why didn't this card get a 10? PSA isn't going to say, well, there was, they're not going to give a report that there was scratches on the hollow foil, or, they don't use subgrades to say, the surface was damaged, so it got docked on that for the overall grade. And then also with these subgrades, it's nice because you can look at graded cards and then really compare them. So like this 9.5, it's gem mint. It's what you'd consider a really solid 9.5 because it just barely missed out on being a Beckett 10. Whereas you know, something with like this 9.5 where it has a 9 and doesn't even have a 10 in the subgrades, it's not as strong of a 9.5 as this, you know, Blue Eyes White Dragon card is. And so these subgrades are really nice because you can make these comparisons, whereas with PSA, every 9 is basically the same, every 10 is basically the same. With Beckett, you know, you can look at these subgrades and the single digit grades, or the subgrades make the cards different. And then Beckett does actually, they have 3 different grading services that they use. BGS, which this card is a BGS, that's their standard grading. BVS, that's Beckett Vintage, for their vintage sports cards. That's where you would, what service you would use for grading that. And then BCCG. I've talked about this BCCG before a little bit, and I'll go over it again, but this is just a Beckett discounted grading service. Typically, like third-party distribution companies will send in hundreds and hundreds of cards to be graded by Beckett, and we'll use this discounted graded service. You can see that this is just overall like a cheap grading service. The paper for the description is just, you know, white paper. This card got a 10, but it's not listed as gem mint. It's just mint or better. The casing is thinner, and then what you can see, the card is just placed in the case, and it rattles around, it moves around, whereas with the Beckett regular cases, that doesn't happen. So this is just overall like a cheaper discounted grading service, and for collectors I would just recommend staying away from these cards. They get high grades like almost no matter what because it's very flimsy grading. I paid $10 for this, you know, Japanese promo card, and the card ungraded is a like $5 to $10 card. And then I also wanted to talk about the Beckett 10 compared to the PSA 10. You know, Beckett 10, it's not gem mint, it's what Beckett calls pristine, and it can be considered better than PSA 10 by some collectors, and it just depends on the collector themselves. Typically PSA is considered better, but like the Beckett 10 is considered better by some than the PSA 10 because it has to meet up to these subgrades, and it has to get, you know, these 10s. And then if a card gets 10 in every subgrade, it's what it still gets the pristine, but it gets a black label instead of this gold, and those are like really rare to come by. When cards get like that Beckett 10, it can really increase the value. I know that there's a Beckett 10 Pop 1 of the first edition base set Charizard in English print, and it's like estimated to be at like a $50,000 card, which is far more than the PSA 10 version of that card. And then Beckett doesn't do qualifiers like PSA, so like I said before, like that Mew card that I showed, if I sent that to PSA or to Beckett, it would just get docked for the centering and not get any qualifier grade. So that's one thing that, you know, Beckett doesn't do that PSA does. I talked about errors with PSA grading, how like the customer service complaints, and those same complaints have been done against Beckett as well. You know, Beckett grading trimmed cards, Beckett damaging cards, Beckett encapsulating cards and then like messing up the encapsulation and not offering like refunds for that. So no matter what grading service you use, there's always going to have been people that have complained about the grading service, and it's just part of kind of dealing with grading services. One thing that Beckett does that PSA doesn't do as far as Yu-Gi-Oh! That's really nice is what I'll show you right here, is that PSA doesn't list the rarity of Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, and so this Cyber Laser Dragon is an ultimate rare, but it's not listed as an ultimate rare in the description of PSA or on the pop report. So obviously any Yu-Gi-Oh! Collector knows that there's a huge difference between this as just an ultra rare card and an ultimate rare. There's a huge difference in value and rarity. Not having this card listed as an ultra rare card or as an ultimate rare card can be frustrating, and it's hopefully something that PSA will change in the future. But Beckett actually does list the rarity in their cards. So this Elemental Hero Flame Wingman, it's listed as an ultimate rare in the description of PSA. They do, list the rarity. Okay, lastly, I wanted to talk about SGC. SGC, I rarely see them used for grading non-sports trading cards, so like Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh, and Pokemon. They're typically mostly just used for grading sports cards. And then how SGC grades is that they use a number system from 1 to 100, point system. And then based off that points, or the points that the card gets off of that system, they give the card its condition grade based on a 1 to 10, the regular 1 to 10 point scale. So the 10 and 99 points get the 10 pristine grade. 98 and 97 get the gem mint 10 grade, and then 96 to 94, I believe, get the mint grade. And so that's again another grading company that does use this sub grading system. And so like this mint 9 card right here, you can tell that it's a solid 9, because if it had gotten one more point, then it's going to be graded as a gem mint card. And so that's really nice. And really, that's like one of the biggest frustrations with PSA, is that they don't have any subgrading service. It's just the one single grade, and whatever it gets, that's what it gets. And you can't really argue on it, or look at why it didn't grade higher. It's just what PSA gives it. And then so for grading, really what grading services you use or what graded cards you collect can depend a lot on like what cards you're collecting. So for sports cards, PSA is typically the best, but BGS is right behind them. Beckett's a very close second. For Pokemon and like Yu-Gi-Oh cards, PSA is pretty much dominant. BGS or Beckett is used a little bit for grading those cards. There is a collector value to them, but typically, like if I was going to grade cards or Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh, I would want to use PSA for multiple reasons. One is that more collectors want the PSA graded cards than the Beckett cards, so they're going to be a higher demand for those cards. And then two, they just sell for more. More people want them, so more people are going to buy them, and more people are going to pay more for the PSA graded cards and Gem Mint than the Beckett cards that are graded in Gem Mint. And then for Magic the Gathering actually has a bigger market, I think, for Beckett graded cards than PSA. It's kind of close, but so if you're maybe wanting to grade Magic the Gathering cards, then that might be an instance where you want to use Beckett, because those cards would be in higher demand and sell for more than PSA graded. That's all I have for today. Thank you for watching.